Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Teen NaNoWriMo series. Every Monday in November, Los Angeles Public Library is hosting programs for National Novel Writing Month for teens. My name is Amanda. I'm a librarian in Teenscape. That is the library within Central Library for teens and young adults. And today I am so honored and excited to welcome Kody Keplinger, best-selling author who wrote her first novel, The Duff, at the age of 17, published it at 19, and has gone on to write many more amazing novels. So, Kody, would you like me to give you a rundown of your books, or should we just jump into asking questions?
We can jump into it. Also, I want to apologize ahead of time. Right as the video started, my cat decides that right now it's the best time to open the door and jump on the bed. So if he makes an appearance walking in front of the camera, that is what has occurred.
This has been my joy of the whole stay-at-home quarantine, is I get to see so many people's pets. Like, they just always make me happy. We don't get to see that when we're at work. So, you definitely give your cat a hug after the interview. One of the reasons I'm just so excited to interview you today is because you wrote your novel, The Duff, at 17. Can you tell us, starting off with like a little background, what were your favorite books as a kid and as a teen?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the best background to know is I actually, when I was younger, I hated reading when I was really little. Or at least I said I did. I was failing reading classes actually in 4th and 5th grade. Well, 4th grade. It was 4th grade when I was failing. And a big part of it was with my visual impairment, I'm legally blind. The books that were being like available to me in large print or on audio were skewing younger than my reading level. We didn't put this together at the time, but I wasn't enjoying myself with reading, and I didn't want to. And my mom knew something was up because she'd always read to me as a kid, always been reading something. One of her favorite stories is that she would read me the newspaper without thinking about it. And this says so much about who I grew up to be. But one day she said she was at the doctor's office and she looked up and realized everyone was staring at her and she couldn't figure out why. And then she just realized that she's reading her infant baby an article about like a serial killer who was just caught. So like she was always just reading out loud to me constantly. So when I said I didn't like reading, she just did not understand. And luckily she worked with me really hard to find things I enjoyed reading. And a big part of that was Judy Blume. I ended up reading, I think, Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, around this time. And I just fell into this Judy Blume rabbit hole that spiraled out into me reading a lot of other things. I remember reading Tuck Everlasting. That was a really big one for me as far as books I loved as a kid. But yeah, I ended up going in a lot of different directions with my reading. I went from someone who hated reading to being in the advanced reading classes within a year because we figured out that like, no, I did like reading, but I needed to be given books in a medium that I could consume since I have a visual impairment, but that would hold my interest. And it took more work and effort than just going to the library and picking up a book. It took some time. And once that happened, it turned into me going, well, I want to write. I love writing. I want to tell stories too, because I'd always enjoyed telling stories, even when I said I hated reading. And now I just had more inspiration, I guess.
So when did you first start writing?
Oh gosh, that's a hard question. I remember being about 5 or 6 years old and sitting at my mom's typewriter in her office. She worked at the courthouse, and I would sit in her office every day, and there was this typewriter and it had no paper in it. And I couldn't write, I couldn't spell, but I would just click buttons and tell her the story I thought I was writing. And as I got older, I started drawing pictures, and I would draw these pictures and I would come up with these elaborate like soap opera storylines of what was happening between the characters. And they were always vaguely inappropriate for my age group. Like it would always be like, and then this character is cheating on his girlfriend with her sister. I was like 8. But yeah, so I loved telling stories long before I think I ever learned how to actually write. And sometime I guess around 8 or 9 is probably when I started really like writing. I wrote what I've called a novel, which was like 60 something pages in 64-point font. Or not 64-point font, 16-point font, 60-something page, 16-point font. When I was like 9, it was basically like a ripoff of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but I was very proud of it, and it just kind of continued from there. It's hard to say when I started writing, because how do you separate being a kid who loves to tell stories from when I actually started putting them in words on paper?
So was The Duff the first novel that you ever wrote start to finish, or what was the first novel that you wrote?
No, it wasn't. Let's see. Well, I wrote what I thought was a novel when I was 9, and then I wrote another thing that I thought was a novel when I was like 13. But the first real, actual, full-length, novel-length manuscript that I ever wrote was when I was 16. So the year before The Duff. Not even a full year before The Duff. I think I wrote it in the summer of 2008, and I wrote The Duff in January of 2009, something like that. And I even tried to get it published. I actually sent out query letters to a couple of literary agents. Didn't get a single response, not one. And I completely understand why. I did not know what I was doing. I had no idea how to write a query letter. It was a mess, but it was the first thing that showed me, hey, if I focus on this, I can actually finish something. And the jump in quality from that book to The Duff was massive, even in just the span of a few months, because I had started really focusing and like putting more effort into spending time writing, I guess you might say. And so that book was a big learning experience. And then I got to The Duff, and that's just sort of where everything launched off from.
How did you decide to write The Duff?
I knew I wanted to write a love-hate relationship, because I was a teenage girl, like many, who was obsessed with Pride and Prejudice. And I knew I wanted to write a love-hate relationship. And there was this joke between me and my friends, because I'd overheard a girl one day use the word Duff in my high school, saying that she hated it when guys referred to her friend as a Duff. And I didn't know what it meant until she told me. And I remember having this joke with my friends that one day I would write a book called The Duff. But unlike all the teen movies, like She's All That, it wouldn't be a matter of taking off her ponytail and taking off her glasses and like suddenly being hot. And she wouldn't be like this sweet angel who everybody realizes at the end of the story, oh, we're the assholes because we never got to know her. Sorry, I swore. Like that was just a joke, though. It was just a joke that we would say, like every time something silly would happen, we'd say, oh, that should go in The Duff one day. But I never thought I'd actually write it. I guess, and it was one day when I was thinking about this love-hate relationship story that I think a song came on the radio. I was taking a shower, because of course I was. And the song came on the radio, and it just suddenly hit me that the love-hate relationship story and this joke idea of The Duff were the same story. They were the same book. And I literally jumped out of the shower, wrapped myself in a towel, ran to my computer, and wrote the first sentence of the manuscript, which is now the second sentence of the novel.
That's awesome. How long did it take you, once you really got going, how long did it take you to write the novel?
The first draft, I hate even admitting this because it makes me so angry at myself now, because I can never do this now. But the first draft took me about a month and a half. I started it sometime in January and was done by the start of March. Wow,
that's like what people are trying to do with NaNoWriMo, that goal to finish a novel in a month.
Yeah,
Have you done NaNoWriMo in addition to writing The Duff in an amazingly quick amount of time?
I have, and I have never succeeded. Not once. Never once. I always say I'm going to try and I'm going to do it, and I never quite make it there. The fastest I've ever written a manuscript, I did write one novel in about a month. It wasn't 50,000 words. The first draft was was shorter than 50,000 words, and I ended up spending over a year just completely rewriting it. The Duff is probably the shortest amount of time I spent writing a manuscript, where most of the manuscript actually made it into the final.
So how many, and this is, I think, like really important So I want to ask this slowly so that everybody who's doing NaNoWriMo right now can get this question. How many drafts did you do for the Duff, and how many do you usually do for your novels now?
Oh, it's different for every book. So the Duff I wrote, let's see, I wrote the first draft, and then I revised it, and then I revised it again after I got a literary agent. So let's see, that's 3. And then I revised it at least 3 more times with my editor. So that was about 6 drafts. And I would say that's actually pretty low. Mm-hmm. I think 6 drafts is actually on the low end. I usually, it's hard to say how much I usually write, because I have written books where I've written a first draft and then I ended up going in and completely rewriting them, like scrapping everything and starting over. And then I've had other books where the first draft ended up being pretty much what made it into the final. We just added more words. Nowadays, I take a lot longer drafting. I can take anywhere from 6 months to a year to get a first draft out sometimes. But the difference is, I guess now my first drafts, I do add things to them. I usually have to add about 20,000 words of more scenes and more material, because I tend to write really short kind of skeletal drafts. But most of the time nowadays, whatever was in my first draft will make it into the final. But it's just this weird in the middle period while I'm drafting where I'm kind of figuring out my structure. And that's kind of what takes me so long, because I tend to write in weird orders now.
Mm-hmm. But one thing I like to remind writers is that, what they see on the page of the book that they buy is not what came out of the writer when they first sat down to write.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, thank you for this like narrative of your drafting process, of how it works for you. Everybody has their own way of working, but it seems to me, I've done a few author interviews, and every author has to revise, has to edit, has to do like more than one draft, definitely. But I think the thing that is really exciting about the story of you writing the Duff is that was your first published novel. Could you tell us a little bit about how you went about getting an agent, getting published, what those steps were?
Yeah, of course. It's actually, in a lot of ways, a very traditional story. I learned about publishing online. I grew up really poor in the middle of nowhere. And when I say really poor, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, like our electricity got shut off more than once because we couldn't afford to pay the bill. Like I grew up in a really poor community. That was not actually unusual. I grew up in an area where you didn't get made fun of for being poor. You got made fun of for having too much money because everybody around you was poor. That was just the norm. But because of that, we didn't have the internet at home for most of my adolescence, even though I was well into the era when most people did. And we didn't really have book signings anywhere near us. I'd never met an author. I'd never had any sort of interaction with any author to know how one gets published. But at the time of my senior year, when I wrote the Duff, I joined an online writing group that I would, should not admit this, that I would get on while I was at school. It was fine. I was on yearbook and we'd finished the yearbook by this point. So we had nothing to do. But I would get on it during my yearbook class after, I got all my work done, and I would join this writing group and I would ask questions. They're like, hey, how do you get published? How do you write a query letter? I would post my query letters and get people to critique them until I got it right. And from there, I had a kind of a network of people who were doing the same thing I was, all YA writers. And they helped me out. They helped me find out what I needed to do. I put together a list of literary agents that might be interested in the kind of thing I was writing. And then it's also how I met some friends that were good beta readers for my drafts. So after all of that, I started sending out query letters, having written one and had it revised in this writing group a few times. And I sent out query letters, and I ended up finding out later that only a handful of my query letters actually made it out, that anything I sent more than 10 pages in the body of the email didn't go through because I was using my high school email address, and it was really, really wonky. Luckily for me, of the couple that did make it out that had smaller sample page counts, one of those agents was like, hey, like very quickly, hey, can I read the partial? And I sent like the first 5 chapters. And the next day she was like, can you send me the full manuscript? And within a week, I had a literary agent. And then that was in May of 2009. I was about to graduate. And that summer, right before I left for college, she sold the book.
That's awesome. I want to take a moment for some people in our audience to clarify a few terms that were used. So your literary agent is the person who represents your manuscript and shops it out to publishers, right?
Yes. So a literary agent is basically someone whose job it is to find new talent and represent you when they sell your book to a publisher. A lot of publishers won't look at unsolicited manuscripts. They won't look at books that don't have a literary agent. So literary agents are kind of curators, if that makes sense. They find manuscripts, they find new talent, and they represent you. It's also really nice because they're the ones who negotiate your contracts to make sure that you are getting paid like an amount they think is worth your time. They are the ones who sometimes get to step in and be the bad guy when your publisher is like trying to strong arm you or something. They have a lot of different roles in many ways. And so, yeah, it's basically someone who represents your best interest and tries to sell your manuscript to a publisher. That's what a literary agent does.
And just for everybody who's watching out there, a reminder, literary agents, they make money when you, the writer, make money. You do not pay them.
No, I teach writing classes, and every time I teach the business, that's the first thing I always say is your literary agent doesn't make money until they have made you money. They take a percentage of what they make for you. You do not pay them. Any agent who says, if you pay me, I'll represent you is not a real agent.
So can you tell us, you also use the phrase beta readers. Can you tell us what beta readers are and what they do for a writer?
Yeah, beta readers are actually something I got more familiar with because I wrote fan fiction when I was a teenager, like a lot of it. And so I was pretty familiar with beta readers via like the fan fiction circles I was in. But beta readers are essentially someone who reads your manuscript and gives you feedback. Like they read your first drafts or your second drafts, your early work, and they'll give you feedback on it. They'll tell you what's working and what isn't, and kind of give you advice on where they think you might be able to revise.
Cool, thanks. So what happened, actually, I would like to know, when did you find out that the Duff was being published, and what was your reaction? What was the steps that you, like, of emotion that you went through?
It was a weird process. I knew it'd gone on submission, which is when your agent sends it out to a bunch of different publishers to see if anyone's interested. So I knew it had gone on submission, but I was convinced it would not sell. Not in like a self-deprecating way, just in that I was 17 and it was my first manuscript with this literary agent, and I knew authors who were much older than me and, in my opinion, more talented than me that had 3 or 4 books on submission and none had sold yet. So I was like, you know what? It would be great if it does, but I'm not expecting it. It's an honor to be nominated. I was kind of at that place. Like it's an honor to even have gotten this far at my age. You know, it'll happen one day. And then my agent called me a couple weeks later. It was very quick and said, listen, I didn't want to tell you this yet, but because I know you won't sleep for the next 2 days, but I have to tell you because your mom needs to be around to be on the phone call because I was not 18 yet. And she was like, but the Duff is going to auction, which meant multiple publishers wanted to buy it. And she was like, the Duff's going to auction. So I think it was a Tuesday when it was going to be at auction. She said, Tuesday night, me, you, and your mom need to have a phone call to figure out, you know, to talk about the situations in case there's any decisions you need to be making. So I was kind of in shock. I did not expect it at all. I think I still thought it's not going to happen. They're all going to get on that auction day and then go, never mind, we don't want it after all. Like, I couldn't believe it. And then Tuesday night, my agent at the time and my mom and I got on a phone call, and there were 2 publishers still left in the auction that I had to choose between. And I'm lucky that my mom is really supportive and also trusts that I know what I'm doing. She trusted that I don't do anything without doing bucket loads of research first. So even though she had to be there to be my parental consent because I was still a minor, she trusted my decision making because I knew about publishing more than she did. I'd spent a lot of time researching it and, teaching her about what I had learned, et cetera. And she trusted my literary agent at the time. I say it's time. I'm sure she would still trust her now. I just have a different agent now. But I had an agent who was luckily really good about keeping me informed and kind of walking me through things as a young person who was still kind of, wide-eyed and green to it all. So I had to think on it a bit, but it ended up being kind of an easy choice to go with Little Brown, who seemed to just really get the manuscript. The editor seemed to really understand what I was going for. And so that's where I ended up. And I had, I think, 3 books published there.
That's awesome. So what was it like to hold your book in your hand once it was published?
I actually think the first time I held my book in my hand is on camera somewhere, which is embarrassing. I was interning in New York City. So I'd held the advanced reader copy, like the early copy, and that was already really exciting. But I was interning in New York when I was 18, about to turn 19. I think it was actually for my birthday. I'd gone out to dinner with, my mom had come to visit. So with my mom, my agent, I think my cousin was there. My cousin Emily was visiting at the time. And so we'd all gone out to dinner, and I had no idea that this was going to happen. But my agent was like, well, your editor is sad that she couldn't be here tonight, but she sent a little present for you. And I was like, what? Because the book wasn't out for another month. But my editor had gotten a couple of copies that had already been printed and managed to make sure that my agent had them for my birthday night. So I got to hold them that night when we were celebrating my birthday. And like I said, I think it's on camera somewhere, which is a little mortifying because I know I was just kind of like squeaky, just like, I know I didn't, wasn't very poised, I'll put it that way. But it was really exciting. I think the most exciting part, honestly, was just seeing my name on the cover of something. Also on camera somewhere is the first time I saw it in a bookstore. After I'd gone back to college and me and my 2 roommates were at, I think it was at Borders. I think it was back when Borders was around. We were at a Borders and we saw it, and one of my roommates pulled out her phone and recorded me like seeing it on a shelf for the first time.
That's awesome. So I also want to remind the audience that if they have questions they would like to enter in the chat, please feel free to go ahead and ask a question. One thing I wanted to ask you, Kody, is that since the Duff, you have published, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, 8 other novels?
I don't think it's 8. Hold on. I do have to count in my head. I've published 3 with Little Brown.
I have an ebook on the list too. I have.
Oh yes, I did have that ebook. Yeah. 3, 2 middle grades, 3 more. I think I've published 8 books total.
Oh, okay.
And then if you count the ebook, then yes, I guess that would be 9. So yeah.
Okay. So you've been writing since the Duff continually. Like you've got books releasing in 2011, 2013, 2015, 2016, 2018, and you most recently have a book. This is Lila and Hadley 2020.
Yeah, Lila and Hadley came out this year.
Yeah. So what's it like to be a professional author, to be writing?
It's so funny because I think I always try to tell my students, I'm like, just so you know, being a writer, even a successful one, is not nearly as glamorous as you think it is. And I'll give you an example. Right now, I'm wearing pajama pants that you can't see below this camera. Granted, I know that's partly like quarantine state as well. But even before quarantine, I spent a great amount of my time in pajama pants.
Living the dream. That's the dream.
Eating cereal and watching Netflix between writing. So it's not nearly as glamorous as I think some people think it is. It seems like it's glamorous when you see it on camera or like on Instagram, but that's just because, like, at least for me, I know I save those moments for when I get to go and travel and go do something that is kind of fun and fancy, but those are spread out. Those are kind of far between. It's harder than I think people think it is. And that's not to be discouraging. Again, I teach writing classes. I encourage people to pursue writing. But I think people need to realize as well that writing is fun. Writing is such a joy, especially if it's something that you love to do, if you love to tell stories. It's fun. But once you start getting into publishing, it is your job. And so even when it doesn't feel fun, you've got a deadline. And that is a hard thing, I think, at least for me to first deal with. But I got really good advice from another author several years ago, which is that you need to remember that writing is an art, but publishing is a business. And you need to be able to walk in both worlds. And so being a writer, I love telling stories. I don't know that I could ever see myself doing something else. But writing is not as just this compulsive, fun, I'm going to send it to my friends thing for me as it used to be. Now, even when I have a story I'm really excited about, I do have to think about my job, that this is my job. How long will it take me to write? What's my deadline going to be like? Is this something my publisher will want to buy, etc.? And so it's a complicated thing because I want to be very encouraging of people to pursue writing, but I think it's important to know that it's not as I think kind of like you just write whatever comes out of your heart and your publisher will take it, as I think people think it is. It's much more complicated and it can be frustrating at times. But like I said, at the same time, I think this is what I was meant to do. I can't imagine my life in any other career.
That's awesome. Oh, it looks like we have a question from our audience. Diet Blue asks, do you appreciate it, Kody, when people send you photos of your books in libraries with a witty comment about the author?
Yeah, I do. I like when people send pictures of my books in libraries or in bookstores. It makes me happy to just know that people are seeing them. The only thing I don't like, honestly, I appreciate pretty much anything people send me on social media. Like, just it's an honor to know people are thinking about you. I think that the only thing I, of course, like, I think in general as just an etiquette thing is if you are making negative comments about the book or you have a negative opinion of the book, that is fine. You're allowed to have a negative opinion of whatever book you want to. But tagging the author in it is usually not a great move just because they can't unsee it, if that makes sense. I personally stay away from my bad reviews most of the time just because I think that's a reviewer space and not an author space. But as far as like pictures of my book out there, I get those pretty often and I always love them. It always makes me happy. My favorites though are people will send me pictures after they bought the book with their pets. And that's the best. If you're going to send me pictures of my book somewhere and you can put your pet in it in the picture, please do.
Pets are always awesome and welcome. I wanted to ask you, while I was doing research for this interview, I came across this video review of your book Run, and the reviewer was visually impaired and she loved this book so much. She had such a huge smile on her face when she was talking about it, and she made a list on her phone of the things that she felt that you got absolutely dead on right about being visually impaired or being legally blind, and it seemed to mean so much to her. As a librarian, I know that like when I connect a patient with a book, I want them to feel that way. I want them to feel represented. I want them to feel respected. Like I hope that whatever book I can find for them gives them that reaction, that sheer joy of seeing themselves and people they relate to on the page. What's it like for you to be the person who wrote that book, who made that art that brings that reaction to people?
It means a lot. And I know that might be like the obvious answer, but I think especially in that specific case you mentioned, I have not seen that video. I should go find that video.
I will send you a link.
As someone who is visually impaired myself, I don't know that I have ever read a book with a depiction of a visual impairment that felt real to me or felt like it mirrored my experience. And that was a big reason I wrote Run. I've read books with blind characters that were okay, that were like, that didn't do anything actively offensive by any means, but they just didn't feel like they mirrored my actual experience. And so for me, Run was me kind of trying to do that, to create the book that I wanted when I was 15. Because I felt for a long time like girls like me didn't get to exist in stories. And so it means a lot when I hear other blind or visually impaired people, especially with that book, tell me like, hey, I've never seen a character like in a book actually use a cane, for example, or talk about some of these experiences, or that feeling of being a burden to your friends, or having that friend that treats you like a burden. Like, these are things that a lot of visually impaired people, not all, but a lot, know really well. And I really wanted to mirror that. And that was also my goal with Lila and Hadley, which just came out, which depicts a girl who is learning to use a cane for the first time, which is something that I had to learn to do at one point. And it's not as easy as people think it is. Like, you have a ring of bruises around your stomach from how often you jab yourself in the stomach while learning to use this cane. And so, yeah, a lot of it for me was, I wanted that exact thing. I wanted people to feel that feeling that I had not felt. And of course, it goes beyond just visually impaired people. I've had other people reach out to me about the depiction of asexuality in That's Not What Happened, or just the depiction of like body image stuff in the Duff. And it always means a lot. It always makes me happy, because I remember reading books at times where I thought, how does the author know what I'm thinking? And that's how I always felt about Judy Blume. And that is kind of been my goal this whole time as a writer, is to write stories where even if they aren't the same experience that the reader has had, there's something there that makes them go, I've never seen someone write my feelings like this.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask you too, because I know you've done work about disability representation in children's publishing. I want to ask if you would speak about how you like use your platform to advocate for that.
Yeah, I haven't done as much in the last few years. I think, I'll be honest, I eventually kind of started feeling a little burnt out. I think we all have over the last 4 years or so, honestly. For me, for a very long time, it was really just important to raise my voice, because I felt like YA has come a long way, even just since I joined it 10 years ago. Like, the YA community has become so much more diverse and so much more proactive about making sure that kids are represented. But I remember feeling several years ago, like we were having these conversations about sexuality and about race, which were really important. And I was so glad they were happening, but it didn't feel like anyone was talking about disability. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think disability is talked about now, and I am really happy about that. But at the time, it kind of felt like it was being ignored. And I remember encountering another disabled author who came up to me after a book signing and was like, I agree with you. I don't feel like people are acknowledging like the disabled community when we talk about diversity. We should, try and spread more awareness of that. And we got a lot of support. The YA community was really embracing of Disability in Kidlit when it was running. I think that was a lot of it for me, is just to make sure that it was on people's radar. I, of course, really want good representation in books, but I think the first step to getting that good representation is to making sure people are thinking about the fact that you exist. Because frequently, people just kind of forget that disabled people are out there, that not everyone can see, that not everyone can walk. And just having that moment of awareness, I think, is where it needs to begin. So that was a lot of what mattered to me, was making sure that people were thinking about this group that was underrepresented, and especially in certain parts of YA. Like, I remember pointing out to someone that, for example, in dystopian or science fiction stories, you need to be aware of not including disabled characters in your world, because to me, as a young reader, I would think if there weren't any even mention of disabled characters in a futuristic setting, to me what that said is, people like me don't get to exist here. We're not allowed to exist in this world. And that can have some really negative implications. So yeah, for me, that kind of speaking out about disability was more to make sure people were thinking about what the implications of not mentioning disability might be. And so, yeah, I'm not necessarily saying you have to include disabled characters in every single book you write, but more that it should be on your mind. It should be a question there, like, you know, are these characters all able-bodied? Just like we ask that question, we talk about other types of diversity.
Yeah, I love the representation in your book. I love that in That's Not the Way It Happened. You actually also feature an asexual character, which I feel is like part of the LGBTQ plus group that like doesn't get a whole lot of representation. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, that's complicated. At the time I wrote the book, I identified as asexual. And it was something that for a long time I felt almost sad to admit that I no longer identify that way, but I've come to forgive myself a bit because I think we all need to acknowledge that sexuality can be very fluid and it's complicated. Not everyone knows their sexuality, when they're a kid or even as a teen. But at the time I wrote That's Not What Happened, I had started learning about asexuality because that's kind of where I thought I was, before realizing that I am probably just gay. But I felt like there wasn't much talk about it. Like there was talk about it on social media, but not many depictions of it, at least in the way that I was experiencing it. And so I always joke that you can track my own understanding of myself via what book I have written in every year. You can kind of see what I am thinking about. Every book that I write is usually me looking into something that's on my mind in that moment in time. So like with the case of Run, I was really thinking a lot about my own disability, and I was thinking a lot about friendships, and I was thinking a lot about like my own first awareness that I might be interested in women and not just men. And so all of those things are present in that book. It's kind of a story, but it's also an exploration of things that I was thinking about. And then with That's Not What Happened, I was thinking a lot about violence, and I was thinking a lot about my own guilt and culpability in how we talk about violence, what role I have played in creating these false narratives. And that was a lot of what I was exploring in that book, but I was also exploring things about disability. There's a couple of disabled characters. And I was also kind of figuring out my sexuality, which at the time I felt was asexuality. And so I mostly just wrote Lee, the main character, in a place of this is how I am feeling, and this is kind of where I am, and these are some of my fears and my understanding of this. And even though I no longer identify that way, I'm very glad that I wrote that book when I did, because it's in some ways a little time capsule of where I was. And I've had many people reach out to me and say, hey, this really helped me. Like this made me realize that like, it's okay if this is how I feel, and that this mirrors how I've been thinking for a long time, and it made me feel good to see myself in that book. So I'm very, very happy with that. I am thrilled that some people have found that sort of representation in that story.
I do want to ask you more about the ways that your stories push back against tropes, against conventional narrative, and like That's Not What Happened. I'm sorry, I misspoke about the title earlier, but the way that That's Not What Happened addresses those things. So we also have a ton of questions from the audience. I want to go ask a couple of those before we get back to my questions. So we have a question. Let's see. Have you ever felt panicked or nervous when you can't think of something to write?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. All the time, actually. I am an anxious person by nature. And there was a period, I guess it was last year. I can't remember if it was last year, if it was early this year. Time is meaningless now. But where I was trying to think of the plot for my next book, and I just couldn't come up with anything. Like I would have scenarios, but no plot. There was no through line. And I remember at one point thinking, am I just a hack? Have I just run out of ideas? Have I written everything I'll ever written? Which was not the case. I have figured out what I am writing next. since then, a couple of things even. But I definitely get panicked when I feel like I don't have ideas or can't come up with things to write. It can be scary and it can be hard, but I think sometimes it just takes time. Unfortunately, when you are a professional author, you don't always have that time because you might be on a deadline. But yeah, I think for me at least, that panic has become kind of normal, and I just have to remind myself, like, I always feel like this. I eventually figure out where I'm going. It'll be okay.
And then we have another question about what themes and genres you'd like to explore most in your future books, from Sleeping Dragon.
Ooh, themes and genres. So most of my books have all been realistic fiction, but I love fantasy. Love fantasy. I'm a big old nerd. Have been since I was a kid. I play D&D multiple times a week. Like, I'm a dork. So one day I would love to do fantasy. That's on the list of things I'd like to do eventually. As far as themes, I love doing things non-linear and playing with the way we tell stories. This was a big theme in Run. It was a big theme in That's Not What Happened. It's a big theme in the book I am currently drafting. I love playing with structure. If you've ever seen, I just started watching it recently, but the Netflix show, The Haunting of Hill House, like, that show is so masterful with how nonlinear it is and how it tells a story. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I love to explore. It's a nightmare for writing because, oh my gosh, that outlining something like that is so tricky, but it's something that I love. It's definitely a theme I like to play with. There's a couple of themes of things that I'm going to be exploring in upcoming books, but I can't talk about them yet because they're not announced. But those are things that are kind of consistent for me. One day I'll write fantasy, and as far as themes I'm going to explore in upcoming books, definitely nonlinear narratives and how you can tell stories in ways that aren't so chronological.
Awesome. And can I ask, you mentioned RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. I play Pathfinder myself. So I wanted to ask you, how has playing role-playing games impacted your writing?
Oh, that's a great question. Honestly, for me, role-playing games have kind of been a way to revitalize making storytelling fun, if that makes sense. Because writing is a job for me now, where writing used to be my big creative outlet, and it still is sometimes, but it's my profession. And so I needed another creative outlet, and role-playing games have been really great, especially tabletop games, because they blend two things that I've always loved: storytelling and theater. I was a theater kid. I did theater even in college. Like, I love theater. I love improv. And so role-playing games have kind of married those two things for me. And it's also nice because I sometimes will GM or game master, so being the storyteller. But most of the time I'm a player. And being a player is kind of nice because it means I have to learn something that is a bit hard when you're a writer and are used to being the master of all the stories, which is, I actually don't have power over this narrative. I have the power of what my character does, but there are dice and there's a game master. And it can be kind of a good exercise in, like, trust and in how I look at stories, I guess, if that makes sense. I love D&D. I love RPGs. It's definitely become probably my most active hobby at this point in time.
Do you ever feel like when you're playing and somebody else is the GM, the game master, like how your characters must feel when you're heading towards something and you don't know how it's going to turn out? Do you ever feel a kinship to your characters when you're playing a role-playing game? That's the question.
Oh, that's a good question. I guess not, because I don't think about my characters in my fiction as always knowing that something bad is about to happen. My characters in my fiction don't know that they're secretly rolling some dice, you know? Although they're not, I guess. Everything for them is pre-planned. There is no dice that's going to save them. Whereas in tabletop games, like, it's improv. My books are outlined. I know exactly where things are going. So while I might feel for my characters, I feel for them more in the way of, I know it's about to happen to you, and I'm so sorry. Whereas in tabletop, I don't know what's about to happen next. I don't know until I get that natural 1 on that D20 roll. And I'm like, well, we'll see where this goes now. I don't know what's happening next. There's no outline.
I should clarify for all the non-D&D players that a natural 1 is an epic fail. You do not want to get that. We have a question that is very D&D specific from Allison. What race class do you normally play in Dungeons & Dragons? Tiefling bards and drow warlocks are my bread and butter, says Allison.
Oh my gosh. Okay, first off, I love drow. So yes, good choices.
Me too.
So that's a hard question because I play so much D&D. We're in my bedroom right now, which doesn't have any of my art up, but if we were in my living room, most of my walls have art of my D&D characters on them, like commissioned art that I have gotten. My longest running character, I think, is my drow sorcerer. But I also have, I have a monk, a human monk. I have a half-orc paladin that I love. The first D&D character I ever made, actually technically not for D&D, it's for a different tabletop system, but similar, that I ever made and that I love so much that I will be getting her tattooed on my arm literally later this month. It was an elf rogue. Specifically, if you're familiar with Dragon Age, a city elf rogue. So yeah, I play pretty much every race and class you can think of. But drow, I have a soft spot for drow. I think it's because I'm a goth girl and they're basically goth elves. Like I love to make me a drow character that is, especially if they're like good aligned and struggling with that whole thing. I love it. I love drow.
That is my current character in 5e, so I'm with you on that one. So we have some questions about media. How much does consuming new media impact your work?
It depends on the day, actually. So during quarantine, I have consumed shockingly little media. I did the opposite. Everybody else was like, I finished watching everything on Netflix. And I was like, I haven't watched anything. I haven't read any books during quarantine. I mostly listen to podcasts. That's the main media I've been consuming during quarantine. For some reason, my head's just not been in it. But most of the time, media has an impact in that sometimes it'll make me go, oh, that is a cool thing that creator just did. I need to learn how to do that. So, for example, I mentioned The Haunting of Hill House that I've been watching, and man, as someone who loves nonlinear storytelling, that show is a masterpiece. And I'm over here taking notes, like, how did they construct that in a way that made sense and wasn't frustrating? I'm so impressed. So that is how media usually impacts my storytelling, is that I am frequently looking at what did that creator do that really got to me, that really excited me, and how can I learn to do that?
And then we also had a question about what your favorite cartoons were growing up.
Oh my gosh. Well, I loved Sailor Moon. That's probably not shocking. I also really loved Rugrats in particular. That's the one I remember. Also Digimon. No one ever talks about Digimon anymore. Everybody's obsessed with Pokemon. Digimon was way more my thing. I still think the first 2 seasons hold up and like as a kid's show and are really, really good. So yeah, those were my favorites.
Awesome. Do you think that any of those cartoons that you watched as a kid influenced anything to do with your writing?
Maybe, because there were things in those shows, probably not Rugrats in particular, but like with Digimon, there were things in those shows beyond the fantasy elements that I really was obsessed with. Like there were really complicated character relationships in that show. I know that sounds wild because I don't think people remember Digimon very well, but like if you go back and look at it, that show had some really complicated character dynamics. Like there was like some sibling stuff and like one sibling turned evil for a little bit at one point. And yeah, I think that I cared more about the relationships in that show than about like the cool fight scenes. And that may have influenced the kind of storyteller I became, and that I have always been really drawn to interpersonal dynamics between people.
Awesome. And Katie asks, what are some of your favorite podcasts?
Ooh, okay. We're going to be here a while. I love This American Life. I think that one is kind of one that most people have heard of, at least. But ones that people aren't maybe as familiar with. I love Lore. Lore is very popular, but it's, oh my God, I love that show. I ended up becoming really good friends with a friend of mine because we did a book event together and we got to talking and realized we both love Lore. So we went to a book signing that Aaron Mahnke did in New York a few years ago. So that was a cool little full circle moment. I'm really into You're Wrong About right now, which is one that same friend told me I should listen to, which is really, really good. It also hits a particular point of my interest, which is how we as a society tend to change the stories of real events and kind of get them wrong. So that one's excellent. I love that podcast. Other ones that are currently that I listen to a lot, there's one called Dragon Talk, which is the official Dungeons and Dragons podcast. There's one called Diking Out, which is a LGBT podcast that I love. There's one called Higher Learning with Ben Lathan and Rachel Lindsay that I listen to quite a bit. Yeah, like I said, I could go on forever. Oh, Reply All. Reply All is amazing. It's one of my favorites of all time. That show has made me laugh and made me cry. It's so good. But yeah, those are just a few of my favorites. I'm sure that as soon as I get off this call, I'm gonna go, why didn't I mention this other podcast? I listen to a lot.
Allison also asked specifically about true crime podcasts and whether you listen to any of those.
Sometimes I do. Not always, but I've definitely listened to my fair share of them. I'm blanking right now. Oh, there's one that I highly recommend, actually, that just wrapped up that was really good on the true crime front called Relative Unknown, which is about a woman who was in the witness protection program as a child because her father had been a member of the Hells Angels and then had agreed to testify against them. But like the podcast picks up years in the future when she's kind of estranged from her father and her father has just committed 2 murders as an old man. And the show is hosted by this woman as she really goes into like her father's, this memoir that they found in her father's belongings and like his whole experience with the Hells Angels and her experience of being in witness protection and what that's actually like. And it's fantastic, really, really well done. Amazing theme song also. So if you're into true crime, but kind of want something a little bit different as far as true crime goes, I highly recommend it. I can't remember how many episodes it is, 8 or 10, but it's wrapped up now and it's fantastic.
Awesome. And so we've got just a few minutes left. So I wanted to ask you that one question about pushing back against established narratives and, tropes that are overused in YA. And specifically, like you mentioned, the podcast You Are Wrong About, the way that we get events wrong, and that's not the way it happened, deals with that issue. And then I love in Run, you've got, some discussion about the way people tell their stories after the fact being different from the way that things actually happened, and the reasons that we might have for doing that, which I think maybe this is, I haven't read all of your work, so I don't know if this is a theme that carries through your work. But then another great thing that I've read about the Duff is the way that the characters are not the standard characters in YA fiction. Like the main characters' friends, Bianca's friends, are great, and they're awesome people, and they're not like the usual, like not considerate friends that the main characters of YA fiction often have, or at least had back in the day. I think YA fiction has gotten a lot better now, but I feel like it seems to me that like a lot of what you're doing is like pushing back against like these things that we tell ourselves all the time, the untruths that we tell ourselves about events or about ourselves, or stereotypes that we use when we're doing storytelling. So I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, as someone who is a storyteller, I'm kind of obsessed with how we tell stories and why. And in diving into that like fascination, I've realized that sometimes being a storyteller means that you have a responsibility, if that makes sense. And I don't mean as a writer necessarily. I just mean in that That's not what happened, for example, deals with a school shooting. And the narrative that we in the US have around school shootings is largely incorrect. If you look at actual numbers and if you look at like statistics and stuff, it's the way we talk about school shootings is kind of wrong. And I remember thinking, wow, I wonder what effect that has on people who've lived through it, especially the narrative around like, especially when a school shooter, which they often are young white men, and the narrative becomes, well, they were bullied or they were mentally ill. It's like we're trying to take the blame off of them. And I've always thought that seems really, and I'm sure I've told that narrative before, but I started realizing, man, that seems really unfortunate for the people who've lived through that event to almost have it turned around and blamed on them, especially with the bullied narrative. Because as far as I'm concerned, when you show up at school with the gun, I don't care how bullied you are now the bully. And I remember thinking about this, especially when I started reading about Columbine. And there's a really great book by Dave Cullen called Columbine, which is about Columbine, but is more actually about the media's culpability in sort of the established, agreed upon narrative around Columbine and why it's so wrong. And Dave Cullen was a journalist reporting on it at the time. And he is having to acknowledge his own fault in like basically getting the information out there soon rather than making sure it was accurate. Because when it's corrected 6 months later or whatever, people aren't paying attention anymore. It's too late. The narrative is out there and it's hard to correct it. And so I started really exploring that. And it's something I find fascinating as someone who tells stories. Like, what is my role as a narrative, like in constructing narratives? And yeah, so that is just a theme that I'm a little obsessed with, that I really enjoy exploring, because I think it's one that we might need to question more. How we talk about tragedy in particular, I think, but also how we tell our own stories. We get to decide how we tell our stories in some ways. Like you mentioned with Run, that is a theme. I forgot that was a theme until you just said that, actually. It's been so long since I wrote that book. So clearly it's something that's been on my mind for a long time. But yeah, how we tell stories and why and what we get out of the narratives that we weave is something that I think quite a bit about.
Thank you. And do you have any advice for the teens in our NaNoWriMo group who are writing novels this month, as we speak, maybe even for the rest of the month and beyond?
All right. Well, I have a few pieces. First, take a breath. It's hard getting 50,000 words out in a month. Even if you're a professional author, it's never easy. You can do it. It's doable, but don't kill yourself trying to do it. Don't rush yourself. Don't make yourself feel exhausted. Remember that even if what you put on the paper doesn't seem good right now, it doesn't have to. You will have time to edit it. You will have more than a month to revise it. Right now, it's just about getting the words on the page. So that would be my first piece of advice is like, take a breath, relax. Don't stress about what you're putting on the page so much as that making sure that you are getting it out there. Even if it's a skeletal draft, make sure that you're actually writing. My next piece of advice as far as being a teen author is don't rush yourself. I know it sounds contradictory or hypocritical to hear from people like me who got published as a teenager, but if I could go back and talk to young me, I would let myself know that being a writer is a job, that once it's your job, it's not just for fun anymore. And while I would still pursue writing, I think I might have given myself a little more time to just let it be fun, if that makes sense. Publishing will always be there. You don't have to get published before you're 18 or before you're 20. In fact, I would say it's better to make sure that what you publish first is something you're going to be proud of for the rest of your life, rather than just the thing you were able to get published as young as possible. And now I'll say this in personal experience. I'm not upset that I wrote the Duff, but it is very weird being someone who's nearly 30. And the thing that people most know me for and most comment on is something I wrote when I was 17. I'm a much better writer than I was back then. And I should be. That's how progression works. But make sure that whatever you are putting out there and trying to get published is because you think this is something you will be proud of for a long time, and not just so that you can say you were published before you were 20 years old. Being published as a teen is possible, but it's not a necessity. Publishing will always be there. Let writing be fun as long as it can be.
Thank you. That is awesome advice. And we are at an hour, so I want to thank you so much, Kody. And I also want to, I misplaced my thanks. I want to thank the Library Foundation of Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much for talking with us. And then I also wanted to get one thank you in here, which I lost on my screen, okay, well, to definitely the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, and I'm sorry I lost the other thing. Oh, there we go. The Lenore S. and Bernard A. Greenberg Fund and the Library Foundation of Los Angeles for making this interview possible. Thank you so much, everybody who chimed in with questions. We really appreciate it. Every Monday in November, we are doing the NaNoWriMo program. Next week, it is genre authors talking about different genres on the same YouTube channel or Facebook channel. That's November 16th. We've got a panel of genre authors. Again, you can ask questions. On the 23rd, that is a Writer's Chill Day led by Emily from Palms Rancho Park, who also, by the way, runs a really great D&D group. So check our calendar for listings. And so that writers event is for teen writers only. Write to teens@lapl.org for the Zoom link for that November 23rd Writer's Chill Day event. And then on November 30th, the very last day of November, it is our big wrap-up event. We will be talking about editing, publishing, everything that comes after you finish your novel. Self-publishing, we're also going to get some resources from editing from our literature and fiction department in Central Library. So keep an eye out for all of that. If you have any questions about any of our programs, please write to us at teens@lapl.org, and we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you again so much, Kody Keplinger, for all of your wonderful advice, your answers, your story. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.